once in a while.
So it's still loud, huh?
Yeah, quite loud today.
We've been having some technical difficulties, but I believe we are streaming and we are recording, so we can go ahead and get started. And we'll try to sort the
right.
technical difficulties out as we go.
Just Clayton will scream at us.
Yes.
Okay. What is today? All right. I call to order this March 21st, 2024 meeting, special planning commission meeting of the Moab City Planning Commission at 3:36 p.m. Present, we have planning commissioners Carolyn Conant, Miles Lofton, myself, Kai Marienfeld, Mikkel Layton, city staff, Anna Englund, Corey Shirtleff, and Bryce, whose last name
Rogers.
Rogers. Goodness gracious. Someday I'll get it. We also have in chambers with us, Michael Black, and the appellant represented by Chrissy Sloan, and we have the city attorney Clayton Priest online with us today. There is no one else in chambers. Excuse me. It does not appear we have any citizens to be heard. However, we did have an email from a citizen regarding our agenda item that came in yesterday, 2 days ago. Some comments and questions talking about the permitted buffer zone that we discussed at the last meeting, which I've seen. Let's see, I don't think we received anything else between the last meeting and now.
Oh, we got a hangout from Eve.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and just pause momentarily. I'm getting confirmation that Eve, who's taking our minutes, is not seeing the streaming, but I am seeing it streaming on YouTube. So I'm just gonna see if she can refresh.
Weird.
Oh.
You're doing that. I didn't see the public comment. Is it the same? Same old, same old?
The nature of that public comment?
Mhm.
Yes.
No new objections.
No, I think it was mostly.
I think it was.
I mean,
and
Kai, if you want to summarize it.
I felt compelled to mention it. It just went to Corey and myself. I'm actually seeing that now. Just a concerned neighbor. Basically, oh gosh.
I didn't see it.
I'm sorry about that. I thought it did send to the commission.
This was just an email to Corey and myself from a concerned citizen, but I do think it's relevant, and so I will forward it to everyone. How about that?
But the nature is more, I think, focused around the construction timing than anything else. But did highlight all the elements that we've discussed so far. In I wouldn't say an objection, but in kind of some frustration about the process, about feeling that the commission is, it's unfortunate the commission is feeling obligated to advance something.
Correct.
That hasn't gone through the correct process. And I think Eve can certainly clarify that further, but yeah, it was not formally submitted, but was submitted. It's worth bringing up. But we can attach that to the record for sure.
Sure. Yeah. I think just in good practice. I think just some frustration with the ill-conceived development that I think legally we have to accommodate was the understanding of the commenter. So, okay. So we received that. I apologize for not noticing until just now that it didn't go to the entire commission. And apologies to that neighbor if that wasn't something that was intended for everyone, but I do think it's relevant. It's part of the public record. So, let's see. We do have approval of minutes from our last meeting as our next agenda item. This is minutes from our March 14th, 2024 regular meeting. So last week.
I did have some comments on those minutes, and
Yeah.
I can share a screen just to show. And it's not that I'm asking for these particular items to be removed from the minutes, but I do think the way they are described could be re-articulated, because there were some points, especially given the intensity of which we're reviewing specific
Mhm.
language and specific points
Yes.
that didn't capture what I felt was the true intent of maybe some of those comments. And they could be at a later date without our presence of this meeting, maybe misconstrued in some way. So I highlighted these. Let me make sure there were, I think, just 5 or so sections. For example, that new drainage in the western property boundary to provide more pavement in lieu of originally proposed drainage. That wasn't the purpose
Yeah.
of why they've amended the drainage. It
Yeah.
was a consequence. So just, the idea of a boundary to, and it's not quite accurate. So there were a number of comments to that degree. So they're, something I consider we either just strike, not that the information is entirely wrong, but, or we reconstruct them at a different
Mhm.
time. Whatever I don't think these comments are critical to the commentary
Yeah.
of the discussion. It'd be easy to just strike them now and approve it, or we can reconstruct them with the original intent.
Yeah,
clarified.
there were a couple things that I had caught as well. Would it be appropriate to just move to table that to the
I think
next
that's
meeting?
perfectly fine.
Cause that one, I think that's very, like you said, these undoubtedly will be important at some point.
Right.
So accuracy, but yeah, the new ordinance does allow
Right.
for the use as a pathway, which is a really important clarification. I
Right.
want to make sure that that's correct in the record.
I think that was it. So yeah, just
Yeah.
four, I guess, 4 comments that are on this page.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my suggestion, coming from the staff side for the minutes.
Great. And then, so would that be you taking first crack at like clarification?
I'm just making it a staff suggestion
Okay,
for the
Cool, that's
commission to adopt.
the things you had
modify or
redlined,
table.
the things you had redlined are also things that I had noticed, so that probably addresses all of my concerns.
I'll have Clayton also take just a quick review of those. Make
Sure.
I'm seeing
Thank
them
you.
correctly.
So in that case, because I think there are some clarifications and quick fixes that need to be made for accuracy in the record from our last meeting in those minutes before we approve them, I would move that we table approval of the March 14th, 2024 regular meeting minutes until we can make those clarifications. That's my motion.
I'll go ahead and second that motion.
Okay, the motion was by me, Kaya, and the second was from Miles. Any discussion or issues with that? Okay, all in favor? Aye. All right, all 4 commissioners present voted aye to table that minute approval, subject to revisions. Okay, next item, action item, 4.1, consideration and possible approval of Planning Resolution 02-2024, a planning resolution approving the major change amendment to the approved remanded Level 2 site plan for the Cottonwood Condominiums 2023 on property located at 214 South, 200 East, Moab, Utah, 84532. Here we are again.
Thank you. I think what I'd like to do is just briefly describe maybe how staff is proposing to organize the discussion today.
Great.
And then move into what will be a very brief recap of essentially the same presentation, but just for the sake of the item being new to the meeting, go over those materials. As staff representation from Clayton on behalf of our attorney, we are proposing to briefly review the project itself, but then also where we had left off, and then I will essentially kick that over to Clayton to describe what the response narrative was that was included in the agenda summary, to explain that and also expand on that if necessary. And then at that point, really maybe move it back to the commission towards specific questions. I don't think we're in a place where we are now evaluating all the aspects of the plan of which we had reviewed the last time, but onto specific clarifications, which is the purpose of why we had tabled item in the first place. So trying to keep that discussion fairly tight to what it is that's being discussed. So go ahead and moving right through this, again, same presentation that we worked through this last meeting. Again, within this vicinity map, identifying the property at 214 South, 200 East, the Cottonwood Condominiums, 9-unit condominium project. Within the background that was presented last time. Of course, we've added the additional action, which was to table this item at our previous March 14th meeting to be reviewed today with aspects of how the vesting rights of the application affect variable aspects of our land use code, variable code to that degree. Specific to the plan, what the major change amendment is that we are looking at again is simply the addition of 2 balconies to the upper center 2 units, which consequently kicks in both the buffering and landscaping standards of 1710 municipal code. And also by consequence of court complying with those has affected the drainage system, therefore this civil plan that was accommodated there. So this domino effect of a slight structural alteration cascading through landscaping and then into the civil design and drainage. All of those, of course, being reviewed by the development review team for full compliance within those standards and have been passed through DRT in compliance with those regulations being reviewed. Within the site plan, again, identifying some of that information that will be called out here as far as locations of balconies through the architectural plans where this is going to supersede some of our other sets. So this particular site plan is fairly important in those notes. Also, this was just back logging through the additional floor plans, moving up through the structure to identify the consolidation of improvements that have been changed since the remanded plan, mostly with roof decking, structural framing, those types of things. And then the civil plan identifying the drainage amendments made to accommodate some of these additional amendments. And then just that motion. So it's really just quite that brief going through the item. And then of course, if the commission has any questions about the content, we can always circle back to it, but I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing screen and open up to Clayton, who can maybe walk us through his response and review of what it was the question we had last time.
So as I understand it, shortly before the last meeting, there was a question that was raised about whether the changes that are being proposed would trigger other changes, would trigger the requirement to come into compliance with other changes throughout the code, most specifically changes to the AEH ordinance. And because of the timing of that, I think it was appropriate for the commission to table this. The applicant was given the opportunity and took that opportunity to provide some extensive briefing to the city staff that was reviewed. And the neighbor that voiced the concern was also given an opportunity, but didn't provide any substantive or further evidence or bases for this question about whether or not other ordinances get triggered by this major change. So that's kind of the context that we're looking at this now. Going first to the amendment procedures, and there's some important language in there that I think helps focus the commission on what it is we're looking at. After we look at that, then we'll take some time to briefly talk about vested rights. Vested rights are complex, and in this particular situation, you know, as we've reviewed it, as well as reviewing submissions by the applicant, there's not any direct cases at the ombudsman or in the district courts that are directly analogous to what we're reviewing here. There are cases that have elements or components of what we're looking at here, but none that are exactly the same. And so it is a complex analysis. So starting back with the amendment procedures, and this is section 1767080 MOAB's code. First, once the site plan is approved, it's binding on the applicant unless they come through this approval process to get an approval for an amendment. And then there are a couple different ways that the amendment can happen, whether it's minor or major. Given the changes, staff felt like this should be handled as a major change. But in subsection C specifically, it talks about major changes shall be referred to the land use authority that originally authorized the site plan for review. And it's that change, the change in the plan that gets submitted to you for review. we're not looking at all components of the plan. We're not looking at the components that aren't being proposed to change. It's just these major changes that need to be reviewed. In subsection D of that same section, it refers again to reviewing this application or the amendment application. So the plain language of the amendment procedures seems to be very clear that our focus is to be on the change that's being proposed and whether or not that change is appropriate, meets the criteria for approval. What I think caused, or at least, kind of raises these questions is in looking at section 1767060, there's a number of different approval criteria. One of them is compliance with the applicable MOAB ordinance and building codes. And so that's where this question really comes in. We're focused in on just this landscape amendment, but in our review, does it trigger compliance with further codes that weren't in place at the time? As the applicant very correctly summarized in their submissions, there is this concept of vesting. And one of the seminal cases is the Western Land Equities versus the City of Logan. And that was cited extensively by the applicant. This really sets forth the rule as how vesting works conceptually. And the rule that was articulated by the Utah Supreme Court is this, that an applicant is entitled to a building permit or subdivision approval if his proposed development meets the zoning requirements in existence at the time of the application, and he proceeds with reasonable diligence absent a compelling and countervailing public interest. That is not crystal clear, right? It doesn't say that under all circumstances, once an application is submitted, that you're vested. There can be certain compelling countervailing public interests that might result in certain zoning rules being applied that weren't in place at the time. The Supreme Court further explained that the purpose of vesting, and in this case, the court looked at across the country different approaches to vesting because they're not consistent. And the court explained some of the rationale behind it. And the court said that a property owner should be able to plan for developing his property in a manner permitted by existing zoning regulations with some degree of assurance that the basic ground rules will not be changed midstream. In other words, once you filed that application and you're moving forward, you're building, you're constructing, you need to be able to have some assurance that the city's not suddenly going to require massive changes. And certainly that's not what's going on here. The final bit of guidance that the Supreme Court gave in that case that I want to bring up, it says that it's incumbent on a city to act in good faith and not reject an application because the application itself triggers zoning reconsideration that results in a substitution of the judgment of current city officials for that of their predecessors. In other words, in reviewing these applications and investing, we have to act in good faith. And just because a zoning application may trigger other zoning considerations, we're not to substitute ourselves for the decisions that were made earlier about what ordinances were and were not in effect at the time. What is somewhat unique about this particular case is you have an approved site plan that went through the process, got approval, then the ordinance changed, which is not uncommon. But what's uncommon in this is there's a very small portion of this site plan, which essentially the applicant is coming back and saying, there are certain advantages to us to be under the new zone, this new landscaping ordinance. And so we want to take this non-conforming, what would be considered non-conforming landscaping, and bring that now into conformance, but we don't want to alter any of the other components of the application. So all we're looking at is this very small portion of the application itself, this landscaping ordinance. And it's not, they haven't added density, they haven't redesigned the units themselves. They haven't done other components which may trigger a larger review. The Utah Property Rights Ombudsman has reviewed this in a couple different instances. And like I said, nothing specifically on point. They note that where the city has rules about not expanding non-complying structures or buildings, that a city may require an applicant to go back and bring this building into compliance with all the changes in the code. And that's advisory opinion number 127. Again, that's different than what we're looking at here, because in that case, the applicant in that situation was seeking to expand this unit. It was a hospital facility, and they were trying to expand that by like another 27 beds. And they looked at it and said, no, that's an expansion of a non-conforming use. You have to now bring this into compliance with everything. The applicant asserts that there's no, and the other thing I think it's a key distinction, in that case, the non-conforming use language was much broader than what we have. In our ordinance, and this is section 1712.040, it says that non-conforming uses may be extended through the same building provided no structural alteration of the building is proposed. In the case that I was just talking about, they specifically included additions or enlargements in additions to structural alterations. And the applicant has asserted that they're not making any structural alterations, as that term is commonly used and defined in code, which there's not looking throughout different, because we don't have a definition of that in our code, and looking at other codes and some other cases and materials, structural alterations is really seen more as changing bearing walls, changing support beams, things of that nature. And that doesn't seem to really be implicated in what the applicant is proposing in this case. So in summary, right, so we've kind of walked through a bunch of different things. Let me give you I'll sum up and give a conclusion as to our review with staff. So in summary, there are changes that are proposed. They don't appear to be altering what would be the structural, wouldn't be necessarily considered structural alterations, as that term is commonly used. And given our limited review of this as to the codes that are in place, and again, looking at not just all codes in section 1767.060, we're just looking at applicable Moab City ordinances. And because of that, in talking with staff, looking at the submissions of the applicant, as well as looking at the cases, there's a strong basis that the other ordinances that were amended after the applicant submitted the changes that are proposed would not trigger those in this case. Certainly, there may be applications in the future where the changes are more expansive. They may, if they're altering density, if they're altering structural components, we might have to look at that differently. But in this particular case, specifically, the AEH ordinance does not appear to be triggered by the changes that are being proposed by the applicant. What they're asking to do is to maintain the vested approvals that they have while bringing a component of the property up into compliance. And so because of that, in reviewing with staff, we don't see a legal basis to require the applicant to comply with other provisions of Moab City Code that were amended after the application, specifically including the AEH ordinance. So I know that's kind of a long and rambling way to get to it. Appreciate your patience in that. It is a complicated piece of law that doesn't really have, like I said, it doesn't have a very clear, direct case that we can point to and say, yes, something very similar happened like this. We're pulling bits and pieces from various cases, various decisions of the ombudsman to look at how they handled it. I'll note as one final note, there is an ombudsman opinion, and this is opinion number 127. Excuse me, that's not the right one. there was another ombudsman opinion, more recently that looked at a similar issue. It's opinion number 263. And in that opinion, they looked at a change that was being requested from a bed and breakfast to a hotel. And that change in use, in looking at this, the ombudsman said, you've got to look at these changes. To the extent there's a change in use, it has to be reviewed on the merits itself, the merits of the change, not bringing in kind of some other components. And the language in that case, again, we're kind of pulling things from different cases, I believe also supports this conclusion that the AEH ordinance would not be triggered. I wanted to make sure that particular advisory opinion also was mentioned, so it's in the record. So with that, if the commission has any specific questions, I'm certainly happy to field any of those.
Yeah, thanks so much, Clayton. Really appreciate it. And also thanks, Chrissy, for your memo. That was really helpful to just kind of draw it out a little bit. Appreciate lots of background. And the staff report was pretty short. So, yeah, questions from everybody. Hit them. I know people have them. Now's the time.
I don't have any.
I have maybe a quick question for Clayton. This may kind of bring the voice back to Clayton. We can discuss a little bit more freely. But in that, Clayton, for just as an example, to kind of give the commission an understanding of where we're at with this, is that based on kind of those terms and aspects and elements of non-conforming, whether it be structure or use and all these variables that would fall into either of those two categories, say something like an expansion of the structure that is increasing the number of units. So currently it's a 9-unit condominium. Say they wanted to increase in some way, whether it was structural and use expansion or just use, to 10 units. With something like that, it seems like would factor in, yes, of course, that's going to kick in that AEH component because it's speaking to the nature of that non-conforming element.
You asked a
Right?
question that
I'm confirming.
Yes.
That is kind of, yeah. So that's a threshold that when we're doing this analysis, and when Clayton and I were looking at this, we were looking at it from this very structured position. But I think it's good to kind of have, okay, well, what would, I think that's a question that's kind of a little bit more of be it simple, but setting the conversation of, okay, we're saying what would, something that like that would be an example of, yeah, that would kick it in.
Or if those decks had been considered a structural change, if they had been important to the structure of the rest of the building.
Good question. And Clayton, you had read that provision, and then that provision continues in our municipal code. So the way Clayton had read it, he kind of stopped. There's additional language at the end of the sentence that helps, I think.
And as Clayton pointed out too,
That out.
we didn't have a definition in our code of what a structural component is, but we're going off other
Right.
definitions in other city codes.
Right.
Yeah, just curious. The very specifics on whether or not what would make something like a deck structural, like if those trusses are coming all the way out of the bottom of the building that are part of your subfloor for the interior as well, and they are creating the deck, is that or is that not a structural element that you are adding or removing?
So I'll read, I think it might be helpful. So this is the definition that was provided by the applicant. It's from another city. But in looking at cities, most cities that do have a definition of structural alteration include something fairly similar to this. The language may be changed a little bit, but they've defined structural alteration as any change in the supporting members of a building, such as bearing walls, partitions, columns, beams, girders, or any change in the exterior walls or roof. So it tends to be something more than just a simple addition. It seems to implicate something on a bigger scale.
So you specifically said any change in exterior walls or roof. And right now those decks have roofs over them. And the roof on our initial proposal was not supposed to extend over the entire deck. On their approval on the last time we did this, that roof was amended to be short to stay out of that 15-foot buffer or whatever was at the time. and now they have a roof that extends all the way over the deck. Does that or does that not, as you just said, that in that language, an extension of the roof, or as you said, a change to the roof could be considered a structural change. Is that or is that not a structural change?
So it could be, is the answer to that. And that definition that was provided, again, it's not one that we've adopted. It's not binding on us. And so it doesn't create, again, right, those specific components. Those are examples of things that you can take into consideration as to whether or not you think there's a structural alteration. I think it depends, and perhaps Corey can talk more about this, but the extent to which that is changed. If this is a substantial change to the trusses, for example, that very well could be a structural change, a structural alteration that would then trigger further discussion or further review under the non-conforming use and as an expansion.
Yeah, with that, I might even share screen. I have the provision that Clayton had read earlier. That way, for at least some of us like myself, it's nice to visually see these. This is that subsection provision Clayton had stated, and he was reading from the subsection A. These subsection A and B, which I believe we may have even referenced in the past to some degree. It's been under much discussion, so I can't remember if we have it on record or not, but this is the first sentence that Clayton had read, and I think if we continue to read through that whole sentence, I think it informs it a little bit more. Non-conforming use may be extended through the same building, provided no structural alteration of the building is proposed or made for the purpose of the extension. Now, this isn't, again, complete within what it is we're talking about. But I think when you take that into consideration with subsection B, a non-complying building or structure or non-conforming use of land may be continued to the same extent and character as to which it legally existed on the effective date of the application. So what we're looking at here are our general provisions for non-conforming uses. We're going to stay away from structures because it is conforming for structure, but uses bundled with what it is that the application procedures hold. And kind of behind closed doors, the way I've been discussing this with our team is, in my metaphors, obviously, is we have what I'm calling our bubble discussion and then this non-conforming discussion. The bubble discussion means what are kind of the vesting elements of an application. Clayton talked about that. What we're looking at through our site plan code is a major amendment to the original application, of which we can trace back to what that original application was. So if we were to, in the future, at some point, conclude this development in a way that detached itself from that site plan review application, we would be looking at a new application, not an amendment piece to an application. So that's the amendment bubble that I'm kind of thinking of. So as long as we're in there, okay, we're looking within that provision. And then within these non-conforming elements, that's what we're kind of trying to pull away from this, is that non-conforming nature doesn't have to be, it can be, but our language doesn't seem to do that, is blanket these situations. There are non-conforming structures, elements, uses, and what we're seeing in this amendment is that the amendments they're making within the bubble are bringing all those components that are touched by that amendment up into full compliance. But the non-conforming element, or what we'll call the multi-household use for ADH considerations, is not being changed. It is still a 9-unit condominium. That has not changed. What is happening is a structural amendment that domino affected into landscaping, domino affected into civil, and all of those have been brought up into compliance as it was touched by the amendment. So at least and this is, Clayton has a far deeper respect for what goes beyond our municipal code. This is just coming from what is the language I have right in front of me, is that is seeming to be the way it's framed, whether it isn't fully thought out to be intended this way. And this is what we've been grappling with within our municipal code. It is what it is until we can kind of get in there and fix the Swiss cheese, where we have all these holes where it isn't clear. There is levels of interpretation. So that's why that subsection A and B, I think, are critical to read fully and together, along with what Clayton was saying about, first of all, the application aspect of it, but then also taking into consideration regionally and nationally, what are these considerations. So I'm sorry, that's my big elaboration. Sorry for.
And to some degree, what I'm
long breath.
asking is, like, working within that bubble, if there are no structural changes that don't put the whole building in non-compliance and require the whole thing to come up to compliance with all of current code, then this is pretty cut and dry, right? If nothing
Right.
triggers that, then what they're asking to do, this small amendment seems
Right.
reasonable.
Right.
But essentially what I'm asking is that by extending that roof and by adding support posts for the decks, which seem to be indicated in their plans, does that constitute a structural change enough to cause them to come out of that bubble and work within putting the whole building out of compliance and make them have to bring the whole building back into compliance with the whole current code?
So I get that question. I think maybe that is, like Clayton said, maybe that's open, but the way that we're interpreting this is that it's easy to put these into maxims. If it's an obvious no and an obvious yes, that's a good place to set your framing. So in this, a structural alteration is being made, but is it being made for the purpose of extending what is the non-conforming aspect? And is that, so is the extension of these decks increasing the 9-unit condominium
Roof to
efficiency?
cover the deck, is that made
So
for
if,
the purpose
for
of
me,
that?
the threshold is if those decks made it a 10-unit condominium or tweaking with the ADH conditions, then I would say yes, 100%. So for the hospital example,
Mhm.
if it's a, certain occupancy level hospital and they're expanding that by 27 beds, what are the additional implications for that use across that? So for something like that, it's kind of a little bit more of an obvious answer of, well,
Absolutely.
yeah,
But
that's where this fine line
with these,
totally
yeah,
agree.
that's, I mean, essentially, that's what I'm asking is, if they're adding that portion of roof to cover the deck, which is the thing that is in question.
Mhm.
Now we are considering an amendment to the structure, i.e. the roof, as defined in that other, and I know that's not our city code, but that's just a general or a like code. But essentially, for me, the question is them adding those roofs in order to add the decks something that brings everything into question, or is it not enough of a change to the structure of the building to be considered that way?
And before we get hung up on the roof, right? That's one part of one definition. And I can give you a few others that don't mention that either, right? So other codes have defined it as any change other than incidental repairs and supporting members of the building, such as bearing walls, columns, beams, or girders. Another one uses the definition changing the support of members of a building, such as bearing walls, columns, lintels, beams, girders, or floor construction. So again, because we don't have a definition, there are lots of definitions of this technical term out there. And so to definitively answer your question, right, does changing the roof, is that a structural alteration or not? We don't have a definition of that term. And there are lots of terms that are used out there with some variation, as I've just shown. And so I think going back to the Western Land Equities case, we have to act in good faith and not reject an application because it triggers some reconsideration that might result in the substitution of judgment. There was a judgment decision made not to define structural alteration. And so now that could go both ways. That could be because we have no definition, that means any change whatsoever. Adding a single nail to the building is altering that structure. That's a very expansive way of looking at that. And then there are more restrictive definitions. It's not something where there is a set definition in code, in either our code or the state code that we can point to and say, for every ordinance in the state, this is what this term definitively means. And so it is, to Corey's point, in looking at the code section and whether or not this is done for the purpose of the extension, that bubble example he gave, we are dealing with shades of gray on this, as at what point something gets triggered. And that's something that, because of the way or our lack of definitions, and that's something that we can't provide you with a precise answer for as this change is a structural alteration, this change is not a structural alteration. Unfortunately, our code is not that clear.
So I guess from a procedural aspect then, if we're working within the bubble and we make this approval today, because within the bubble, if we don't consider it a structural change and it does not, trigger any of the rest of that, then it is in compliance with our new code and therefore, the approval makes sense. So to me, the problem I'm having is like, because of that gray area, am I approving something that is then going to be dropped and it's not going to be an issue forward? Or like, is that something that city or staff is going to consider at some point going forward, whether or not that structural amendment created a big enough change? Or is that like happening right now? Once we make this determination, does that, is that gray area ever going to be sorted out for this development, or is that not?
I think, well, it's hard because if there's a gray area, I think it's our responsibility, it's our job as the land use review authority to not act arbitrarily in deciding one way or another on the gray areas that we come across. And I think particularly now flagging those gray areas for like, this was probably something that might come up again in the future. And it would be great if it was less of a gray area after we revise our land use code, in the next year. Talking to consultants just a couple days ago, like, what are the biggest things? And I think the squishiness of the code is the thing that I kind of kept reiterating.
Just concerns me to not consider it one way or another.
Absolutely. Absolutely, which is why I think just making sure that whatever our determination is, it's well reasoned, is explained, and it fits, thinking back to the administrative judge's opinion in this development that's already been rendered. It was basically, she decided that something was arbitrary and didn't make sense according to the code that, staff had done, and therefore, that wasn't the determination that they could make, but otherwise her determination was that, but the other conclusions weren't, like, it was kind of left up to the code. It was inconclusive in the code, but these determinations weren't made so glaringly that she needed to reverse them. And I think that's the same standard that we're looking at here. So it's really that, but I guess, are you asking if, say the second part of your question, you're asking if this is figured out today?
Well, I'm asking that if we make an approval today, if there will be any consideration going forward as to whether or not that, like, in this instance, for this development, whether or not those roofs or the beams that hold up the deck count as structural amendments, and whether or not by them wanting to come into compliance with the new code in that bubble sense, shall we say, if those would break the bubble at any point, and if anyone in, here would consider, I don't know, I struggle to make a determination on whether or not these fit within the code when I don't know if the whole building should be subject to the complete new code, or if we are just talking about this small portion of this deck, because it seems like it could go either way depending on whether or not we define that extension of a roof or the posts holding up the deck a structural amendment. And if they have to be in compliance with all of the new code, then I feel like, that would lead my determination one way. Or if they only have to be in compliance with the new buffer zone, that would lead my vote the other way. And I'm just curious to have a little bit more of like a concrete footing to stand on to make that determination.
The concrete footing?
Sorry.
Sorry.
Clayton, it looks like you were going to comment.
So, to try to answer again, and it's difficult because there are gray areas. It's not something that we can definitively point to something and say, this is this definition, it meets it, it doesn't meet it. What I will say is, in reviewing this with staff and looking at the advisory opinions that we mentioned, the court opinions we've talked about, it seems that the proposed change that we're talking about, if you're looking at this in terms of a spectrum or a scale, that this would be more towards the spectrum, it would fall closer on the spectrum to this only triggers the changes to the landscaping ordinance, not changes as a whole. In balance, the changes that are being proposed are comparatively minor compared to the other revisions that we've looked at that have triggered the entire building having to be brought into compliance. So can't give you an absolute, unfortunately, but in terms of looking at this decision on a spectrum and trying to use that polarity that you have created as to whether or not this is a just landscaping ordinance or all ordinance question, the changes that are being proposed certainly seem to be more on the side of just this particular zone change, or this just a particular landscaping ordinance.
So I think something that might be maybe illustrative is to imagine that this development was already built and had existed on the ground for 10 or 20 years at this point, and they were coming to the city seeking a building permit to add a deck with a roof with feet. Would the city in that instance determine that they needed to come into compliance with the AEH? Because I feel like that is potentially determinative.
Sure. I think within that.
Where it would be like,
that
like
is-
we've talked about, that if you come for a building permit, the landscaping ordinance applies to you.
Yep.
We've said that explicitly.
Yep.
And
So,
that is explicitly in the landscape.
correct.
Correct.
And I
Which
looked
AH
through the AH and it does
does
not.
That's right.
Yep.
So there's a hole there with an AH we didn't realize
Yeah.
existed.
Yeah. there we go.
Not that it, yeah. right.
But like what level, what rises to the level of redevelopment or expansion versus
Sure.
something that would need approval from the city
Sure.
at a building permit level, but it would be like, you've got a sixplex in the R3
Mhm.
that's been there since 2002.
Mhm.
You come to the city and say, hey, we'd like to add some shade structures off the side of one of the
Right.
sides of the building, off of the doors of some of these units. Would that be something that would then trigger the AH?
Well, so to answer your question, I'm gonna use an example first.
Mhm,
And
yeah.
this was in the approval of the landscaping ordinance. Is there was a comment about condominium developments as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And that within, and this is very specific, a specific condominium development asked specifically, what if we want to expand decks? What if we want to do all these things? And the answer at that time, within the landscape ordinance, despite it being a building permit action or not, the answer was no, they would not have to as a whole community, because an individual action of an owner would not kick in the responsibility of the whole HOA or the whole community
Interesting.
for the common to
Right.
have to improve the whole property. So in that same sense, to me, that question doesn't change when we're talking about the non-conforming provisions. To me, whether this is approved, as you say, this has been approved, it's been on the ground, and we're coming back at a totally fresh slate.
Yep.
My analysis is the same for my Title 1712 analysis. The only thing that would change is that what we'd be looking at it is maybe a different processing mechanism.
Mhm.
So right now, and this is where it's so
Wouldn't be-
dynamic,
it
there's
wouldn't be
basically
amendment. Yeah.
three working layers of code that we're having to filter this through.
Yep.
One is the application vesting, one is the non-conforming nature aspects, and then additionally how we're working that into the use code, what we'll call it, the underlying code. So in your example, we've removed its continuous nature or the amendment ability
Mm-hmm.
as far as that application that goes. It's a different type of application. But the non-conforming argument is the same for me, is that alteration, because this happens, and I know it's very rare the planning commission gets to review these, but this happens constantly on a much lower basis, meaning they are either minor level amendments. And again, that's a very interesting thing that we're talking about, an expansion of balconies. Whereas we look at a minor change and it talks about relocating buildings is a minor change.
Mm-hmm.
It's the simple fact that the way our language is between a minor and a major is you could qualify almost anything as a major, yet the minor doesn't have that same breadth of options. So if we can even look at that language, you can see what we're talking about. So in other types of development, and this is working with the applicants, we said it's right there, structural alterations do count. This was a questionable consideration, so let's run it as a major. That way we're not being put into a position where, oh, we could have gone either way and we chose the wrong way. We're just gonna go with this option. But like Clayton was saying, something as simple as a nail, depending on how you want to define it. There are, with the construction, numerous work order changes and roofing changes, a number of those things that happen on every project. But whether it works its way up through the levels of land use authority is kind of the question. So we deal with this question all the time. That's why for me, this is fairly simple. We deal with it all the time. But as it comes to a major level and with the planning commission, it does become a little bit more complex. So I do understand that. But again, for me, so in your example, the answer is I'd probably be treating it the same way in your example I am now, which is I don't think this extension is advancing the non-conforming aspect of this development. It does increase the structural piece, but the structural piece is complying. So if this were non-conforming structure, the answer would be an obvious no. You're increasing or changing a non-conforming structure. But if it's a use extension, I think our code says to the same character and extent, and this is where it's squishy. It could be argued, are we changing the character and extent of the non-conforming nature? Would you describe it any differently with these balconies or Sin's balconies? Is it a different project?
Well,
And that's what is soft.
also considering the balconies and the roofs already exist, is this not currently a non-conforming structure because it is not?
It's not
what we
non-conforming,
recommended
but
ahead
it
of time?
has been built outside of the parameters of the permit.
Yeah.
So it has had red
Doesn't make
tags.
it
It's
non-conforming.
no, that doesn't. Those are different.
Yeah.
We're talking kind of legal entitlements
Yeah,
and those types of
existing uses
those types of
that are,
things.
yeah.
Yeah, deviations from construction again happen all the time, and so that's why I know it's a little bit sour for the commission to be like, you just did it. Now we're talking about it, but
Yes.
this happens often, and it's really hard for a building official. He continually is keeping people within their permit because on site sometimes stuff happens and makes more sense to build this way, but you didn't go through the full process of getting your permit changed. But yeah, no, it does not make it.
Perfect.
It's not
Yep,
conforming. It is
just asking.
it's built
Yep.
outside of the parameters of the permit, though, for sure.
We're gonna talk.
okay, I have some questions. Let me roll through mine. You answered my when feasibly would the AEH then apply to this project? And the other answer would be if their approvals lapsed, right? And they had to reapply.
Correct. So
Yeah.
that goes back to the bubble. Sorry, I'm pulling you guys. into
No,
my
that's
metaphor
okay.
world.
The bubble's
But in
helpful.
shorthand,
Bubble's helpful,
saying the
honestly.
bubble, yeah, then your vesting application period
Yeah.
is gone.
Yeah.
You start fresh. So whatever the holistically applies at the time.
And
Yes.
here we are talking about, I really appreciated the, applicant's memorandum. There was some inconsistency about what the vested application was and what that was referring to, and I think it's important. If it is vested and the AEH doesn't apply, it has to be the site plan application, and because everything else postdates the AEH passing. So I'm just confirming that we are talking about the site plan application on May 9th, 2022.
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
not the building permit application,
No,
not the building permit approval,
correct.
all of which were referenced as the vesting item
You're-
at one
you're-
point. So I just want to make
I
sure.
see. No, which can be, I guess, and that's what's
What,
hard.
which is the
Is
ombudsman's
depending on-
opinion is very clear that it's an application for something, not what application. it
Right, and
is.
so whatever we consider is the highest level of approval you'll need, so if you
Yep.
need planning commission approval, that application that would lead you to that.
Yep.
But all the consecutive applications you'd need are within that bubble,
Correct.
so to speak. But some people, we have some things coming up through right now that have a building permit that preceded AEH,
Mhm.
but the rest of some of their applications are post that effective date, and we're actually, this is illuminating very clearly how we're gonna treat those of, say, a townhome development that's got its building permit for the townhome blah blah blahs, and now they're going for their plating exercise, which is a new application. But it was always designed indeed that way, so very valid questions, and we've made some pretty aggressive ordinances, and now we're having to work through how these work being so aggressive.
Yeah,
For sure,
totally.
for sure.
Cool. I just wanted to make sure.
Good
we're-
clarification. Yep.
Yeah, that's, I
time.
think, I mean, it's a conclusive determination that if it isn't, then
Totally.
no,
Totally.
because it goes site plan application, AEH, then everything else in the process, basically.
Correct.
Is the timeline. Let's see, what else did I have here?
I guess I should say, as you're concluding that, your entitlement of use. So you
Yeah.
submit an application for something for a use, that's where that
Exactly,
goes in.
which would be the
all these are supporting applications, but it's not your use
Yeah.
application.
as the applicant representative put it, the unrestricted residential use. Let's see. Which is a good way of phrasing it.
One other thing to note, the Utah Supreme Court's been very clear too, that when there are uncertainties or ambiguities when it comes to restrictions, that courts have been instructed to resolve those doubts in favor of the free and unrestricted use of the property.
Yeah.
In other words, if we have a tie, it goes to what the property owner is requesting.
The same way that we as the land use authority are encouraged to, if things meet criteria, to determine in favor of whatever the amendment might be for the property.
Right.
Second question, just the flag, as I was laying out timeline and trying to put that all into context in my brain, the fact that there was a pending ordinance doctrine that expired makes no difference. Okay.
Nope.
Yep. Just wanted to make sure that that was something someone had thought about at
Yeah.
one point.
Yeah.
I don't remember when that expired relative to things.
March
but-
30th,
Do you remember?
never forget. Actually, it was April 4th, but the meeting was March 30th.
It was a dark day. Let's see. So let's see. Yeah, just some. Yeah, I had some questions about which was it. Hi, Zoe. Bye, Zoe. Building permit, site plan, what else do I have? I think that was really it. I think the weird language with the level 2 site plan amendment criteria is like the truth in submittals, which is a very interesting phrasing, which is also very subjective, right? That's one of the criteria that the applicant
I
has.
see what you're saying. Yes.
Yeah. I feel like, yeah, the accuracy and truthfulness of submittals or representations in the application.
Mhm.
I feel like in the plainest terms, that did not happen in their applications, which don't note the fact that the balconies are already there, which say that they're going to get approval for X, Y, and Z before anything commences, in at least what we were given. That may not have been the case with any emails or attachments or communications with the applicant to staff, but at least for what the planning commission has in front of us, it's just that, what is it? Those exhibits B and C and D are the things that were submitted prior to our meeting last week.
Mhm.
So I wanted to flag that. I was wondering if that ultimately mattered or if that's in there just saying like, hey, you're not lying about what you're doing, or it's not something that we've had to interpret before. So
No, I think that is a provision in which, as the execution and development goes in, it's mostly for liabilities, mostly for, I would say, utility or any other types of items that if we're approving it on paper and then
Mhm.
there are changes that aren't inspected, that we don't have capacity to, and it's built incorrectly, and then the event happens where that needs to be analyzed, is that deviation or the lack of, I want to phrase it very correctly, and I think I have it right in front of me. The accuracy and truthfulness of the submittals just means that you're doing the best of your ability to actually put out there what you're going to do, is not our liability that you've deviated from that. And it
Yep.
would also default potentially that your application, because you haven't met the criteria for the application.
yeah,
I think right now that is an interesting note, but I think what is being proposed is intended, I think, to be fully accurate and truthful, which is the whole purpose, is to get the project back on track. And us as the commission to fully understand what it is that they are going to do.
Yeah.
So between the remanded actions and then the building permit elements, there could have been that criteria question. But I think this is resolving what would be maybe considered that criteria point.
So it was like not in keeping with their past assurance that contractors shall obtain necessary permits prior to construction.
Say that again. Sorry.
So one of the notes, I think on the cover of I forget which submittals, contractor shall obtain all necessary permits and
Sure.
approvals prior to construction.
Right.
Contractor shall have a copy, all those kinds
Right,
of
right.
things. So if they're not then in compliance with components of that, it's the indication that they will be in the future on the new.
Which is kind of
Submittals.
the idea, like, we have the authority to red tag you and then bring you back before the
Yeah,
planning commission to reconcile. So we're executing, I think, the
Yes.
remedy of that,
Yeah.
because like you're saying, they were built.
not get
Would that
rid of the decks. It's the remedy being get rid of the decks or you'll
The
be-
remedy being
yeah,
come back here to
or
to
come back here
have
and,
an approved plan.
and to have an approved.
Yeah.
plan. Yeah. I think that's what I had for now. I would love if other commissioners had questions or comments or things we need to discuss. Go for it.
I don't have any questions. I think I had a lot of the same questions that others already raised and it doesn't, I think, there's a couple things that seem to be rubbing a few of us the wrong way, but the interpretation of what the options are seems to be kind of settled. I think it is important that these conversations have surfaced a few areas where we might find ourselves at risk of having to do these kind of squishy interpretations of the gray areas in the future. So we're flagging those things that have come up in this meeting and the last. One of which is maybe the need for a definition or exploring what it might look like to have a definition, whether that would be helpful or hinder us further for structural alterations in the code. Another one, last time there was a lot of discussion about whether the gravel pathway falls within, the intended considerations of the landscape ordinance buffer. And I think there is that confusing language in sections J and K where the nature of the buffer elements are intended to specifically reduce impacts on adjacent land. And it would be more clear to say not increase impacts on adjacent lands, because I don't think you can argue that a path reduces impacts. And then possibly also that hole in the AEH where that was just mentioned about, pulling a new building permit, not triggering the need to come into compliance.
Yeah, I think that's
a big one.
clarification.
Agreed.
Kel,
I have a question about the whole.
which,
vesting
I'm so
thing.
sorry, would you mind speaking to
Oh,
your mic?
Yes,
Thank you.
everybody wants to hear this. Questions concerning the vesting and I guess the process between the planning department and the building department. The first thing you get is site plan approval, and then you can apply for your building permit. Yes?
Correct.
Okay. I think in one of the last documents we got, the timeline laid out that the site plan was approved July 14th of 23,
Yeah, that
That was
was
the
us.
remanded site plan, yeah.
remanded site plan, and then the building permit got approved February 9th of 23.
Mhm.
So the building permit got approved before the site plan.
Before the
remanded
remanded site
meeting,
plan.
it was approved, building permit approved. We had, the appeal process go through, and it was remanded, meaning brought back to planning commission. So it was approved and then brought back for a reapproval.
And then at that time, you would review the building permit again
Correct.
in,
That was in compliance with the remanded approval, which, it was.
so there would have been a new approval for the building permit.
It was never, and Clayton, you can check me on this. I don't believe the building permit was ever closed. They've maintained the consistent building permit number. It was put on hold, obviously, but it was not, the building permit was not remanded, nor was it put on hold. Only aspects of it were put on, red tag, so to speak. But I don't believe we had the need to, dismiss that building permit and reissue a different permit.
But you would have had to review the building permit based on
Correct.
remanded site plan. When did that happen?
Following the approval of the remanded site plan.
So
Bill-
after July 14th of last year.
Correct.
But we're saying that the vested date of the site plan was before August of 22
Correct.
and the building.
Clayton, you're muted if you wanna.
Sorry. So when it comes to the vesting dates, the date isn't, the date when something is vested is when we get a complete application and the fees are paid. And
Full-
if,
No.
No.
and not approval, it's the date that we have everything,
Which was in
Application complete.
2022,
a complete application.
early
Yeah.
2022.
So if they put their paperwork in but didn't pay the fees yet, that's not a complete application.
Correct.
But once the fees are paid and an application is put in, that doesn't just say, I want to build a house, like, it's got some level of detail, I think, that, which would have been May 9th of 2022, which well predates the AEH. That's the important date.
These friends had no additional fees through all of this other stuff that happened.
Additional fees,
Through the red tag process and all of that stuff. They had no additional
fines?
fines or fees of any kind that they had to pay.
They've paid the appropriate application
The
fees that were
application,
necessary. Like we said with the bubble, there's a cascading application process through all these things.
Mhm.
And with fine, I don't know. That's a compliance question,
Okay.
but I don't know if that's relevant.
And I'll say
Fascinating.
what we're looking at is if you were to take the application form itself, that form itself will say, there's some fee that gets determined when you submit that application. And sometimes it's based on what's being requested. Sometimes it's based on the square footage of what's being reviewed. That's the fine, that's the fee that we're talking about. Once that's paid and that application is submitted, if subsequent fees or fines come up related to the property, like the red tagging, just for the sake of argument, if they received an administrative fee for $150 because they built outside of the permit and they were red tagged, that doesn't trigger a new vesting date. It's that initial application and fee.
No matter how many changes or how many amendments or
Just that initial application.
Mhm.
Correct. It all comes back to that initial date.
thank you.
Anything else, Mikhail? There was something you said you wanted to talk about that. What was that? When Miles was talking or when Corey was talking, I don't remember.
Oh, about the decks and the deck situation and all of that stuff. And that's something that we can deal with through our motion, right? Our motion, if we made a motion to approve, we can do that with conditions.
So motions
Yeah.
can be conditional. I'm not sure
yeah.
what condition
What
we
would the
impose.
This was discussed earlier. Clayton, you might, maybe.
I
you
don't know
better.
that we're at
Yeah.
the end of this.
Yeah,
game.
you might,
Is the bubble full? Are we,
you,
or have we popped the bubble? Are we blowing bubbles? What's happening?
yeah. As far as motions go, any commissioner is capable of making a motion of which, if it does not receive a second, the motion will die. If it does receive a second, we're able to have discussion, and then can vote on that. If that motion does not pass, it returns to the floor, so to speak, and we will continue to discuss until a motion is made that is accepted.
We will keep you here all night.
And I think in answer to your question, if I'm understanding it right, when we're reviewing amendments, you can approve with conditions, or deny the application for the amendment.
Right.
Deny with a narrative.
Yeah, fine,
It's
yeah.
Basically,
fine.
yeah.
No matter what you decide, there should be a basis for what your decision is.
Yeah, so we could have a conditional approval if we think that there are conditions that we could seek to impose on the applicant that would approve what they're seeking, but assuage some concerns if there were something that someone was thinking or that staff had recommended.
Yeah,
Nothing springs to mind for me, but that's certainly on the table.
this is administrative.
Yep.
Meaning there's not a discretionary action or criteria set of discretion. So if there is a condition of approval, it needs to be administratively based on the code.
Sure.
That they are
So it could,
conditionally proved that they follow this aspect of code or in a certain way.
exactly, so it could be something with the explanation of how they meet X approved condition of approval that wasn't clear up until this point or something.
Sure,
like that.
resolve or
Yeah.
inform. What I want to be careful of is, like we did with one of these site plans where the commission does have some discretion on content, which is in the site plan. Say when we were talking about fence heights, there were some conditions about that was contemplated with reasonable cause. That's still in the code, but I don't know if that. Well, I guess it depends on the condition you're like discussing. We can discuss that. Yeah. Depending on the content of what that is.
Excuse me. I mean, I still am frustrated by this application. I will say I'm of the mind that administratively it does meet the requirements for approval. That's being the sole question on the table in front of us. Because it's in that, I think the vesting question has been answered satisfactorily to me that the AEH would not kick in because of this. It is sort of operating in that bubble again. Whereas there are definitely things or changes that might be sought by a developer mid-build that would inherently kick that in and take them out of that vested right. Like I think that the best example is increasing the number of units somehow or seeking something that the AEH does would be an obvious thing, like seeking to increase height and lower parking requirements would be
Right.
two very clear things where you're sort of.
That's a wonderful example. I apologize for not using it.
No,
earlier.
it's fine.
That's in the code right now. Yeah, there's additional height. There's bonuses that are not being pursued because they are immediately tied
Yep.
to AH. That's a perfect example.
Yep. I think the manner in which it came about is certainly frustrating. Not good form, but again, things do happen, and I think it's sort of impossible to track that down about who did what, where, and why, and was it intentional? And that's not our job. It's ultimately city staff and code enforcement. I appreciate that, there are some changes being made that I think are going to make, like the applicant was saying last time, make the overall development better as far as the landscaping ordinance goes. But yeah, it's, and now to have things now instead of adding the decks later, I think is complicated.
I'd just like to say that in this particular instance, what this has brought me to in a lot of ways is, as Kaya pointed out, I think administratively, it's kind of cut and dry. They are compliant with our current landscape or the new landscaping ordinance. And so in that case, like, that is what it is. But it does make me think that, does make me think that we need a definition of structural change or structural amendment, and that we need a clearer path to understanding that if someone's making something that can be considered a major change on their site plan and on their build, that we have recourse in saying you can't just choose to come into compliance with our landscaping ordinance. If you want to make a major change, you must be fully compliant. If you want to make a minor change, extend an eave by a foot or two, that's one thing. But if you're adding an element like a deck, it seems like a major change to me. Then again, moving a whole building seems also like a major change to me, and that's not necessarily right now a major change. But I think just personally, as a note going forward, I would like to see those reviewed by us or whoever else, staff, however that goes. But that we better understand that if these developments are going in, especially things like condominiums, multi-housing, hotels, stuff like that, that if they decide to change a significant portion of their build enough to be considered a major change, that then we have a little bit more recourse to make sure that the major change that they're making still make sure that their building or development is in compliance with our community standards and community codes. To some degree, while administratively this makes sense to me, the way it's gone about it has made me feel as though they are not. The spirit of it feels a little off,
Mhm.
and I understand that's not ours to determine here.
We can say that though.
But the spirit of it feels
Yeah.
off. for me.
Well, and I think that's important. I just want to say I really appreciate staff and the applicant, I think, who's admitted that, like, yeah, it's unfortunate how it came about. And the commission for just being able to say, like, hey, this kind of sucks, but our job is X, Y, and Z, and we have to do our job. But I don't think that means we can't say, hey, that sucks. And that the community isn't happy to see things just like this happening. Both of the letters from citizens that we got were distaste with how this has come about. And I think that's important. And I think reiterating that for anybody looking to develop in the community or do anything with their property is just the optics matter. And I don't think we would be having these super long drawn out conversations about things that I think administratively are more cut and dry. Were we not needing to make sure that we were voicing the concerns that have been brought to us as citizen representatives of the community? And I really appreciate the commission's willingness to hold both of those truths at the same time. And not impose arbitrary standards just because we don't like something, but also not feel like we can't express that. And strongly encourage anyone to,
They could voluntarily
that.
do it if they wanted to.
Yeah,
They're
yeah.
Not gonna, but they could.
Yeah, they could, totally. So, that's kind of where I'm at right now too. There were a few other things just maybe before recording to flag for the applicant in the new applications. There were some things, it was clear like a copy and paste error, with other site plan documents where things still said like the city of Delta, or referenced counties in Colorado. So just a thing to flag before final recording.
These were within the memorandum documents.
Within the, I'm losing track, within the architectural site plan review and the civil site plan review, the revised documents. I can flag those specifically for you if you want, but just as I was like actually reading everything really closely, I caught a couple things. But I get that. I definitely have briefs I filed that referenced something was not the current brief. Okay, that's it for me. But yeah, that's pretty much where I'm at. If others have things they still need ironed out, any remaining questions for Clayton, anything they'd like to hear from the applicant's representative, now is the time. I think we may get someone's determination on this after this, one way or another, whether it be the ombudsman or whether it be an appellate authority. So maybe we'll have a more conclusive answer in the future just based on case law. So,
Yeah.
Which I'm also really curious about, so. I think regardless of how we decide, I will say. Yeah. We can entertain a motion as well. Just to review, the options on the table are to approve with or without modifications. We could continue or table it if we have further questions or specific things that we still need to make a decision, or we could deny it with findings for that decision. And as always, there is a proposed motion on page 1 of the agenda. There's a lot of information here. Thank you.
In
for
the
getting
agenda
this-
summary.
Yeah,
It continues to, it
I was
continues to
like,
grow.
that's a,
I
It's a fairly
apologize.
significant-
that's a
Uh,
paragraph.
Lot of
I had a couple
reading.
people asking, where on earth is this information? Like, it's in there.
I know, I
just
saw
gotta-
Mikkel's, I was like, what?
You gotta.
I know.
Yeah.
This
Yeah,
has been
dive in
a
there.
lot of reading on this one, a lot of supporting documentation. a
It's
lot of
having
reading.
flashbacks to law school this morning. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I never went, so that's.
It might be better, coming into it fresh actually might be better.
We could do nose goes.
All right, all right. So
Uh,
I guess after all of our discussion and understanding that from a purely administrative position, which is where we're at, and understanding that with regards to vested interest or with regards to the property being non-compliant and requiring full compliance, both of those things are not something that are affecting our decision today. Or the vested interest is affecting our decision today, but they do have that vested interest. So with that being said, I guess I move that the City of Moab Planning Commission approve major change amendment to the approved remanded level 2 site plan for the Cottonwood Condominiums 2023 project on property located at 214 South, 200 East, Moab, Utah 84532.
Okay, we have a motion on the table, to approve, the major change amendment. Do we have a second?
Nose go.
Be anybody.
I will disgruntledly second.
So if I can begrudgingly make that motion.
Yeah, we have a begrudging motion and a disgruntled second.
Solidarity.
I think we have a motion by Miles, a second by Mikkel. Any discussion, clarifications, amendments we need to make to that motion? Anything like that?
I think in regards to whether or not it complies with the landscape ordinance they're trying to comply with, they do, absolutely. I don't think there are any amendments we can make or that would be necessary. So,
And importantly, I think the conclusion of the commission is that they do meet the criteria for this to be an amendment in its own zone without implicating larger things, that were vested rights
Yeah.
already, or just frankly implicating larger things by it not being a structural amendment.
I think with current code as written and
Yes.
without a definition for structural amendment and without some clarity in the AEH code about what triggers it, in this current instance, that is true.
I think, and examples from staff as well of other times when it was a structural amendment versus when it was not a structural amendment. Things that require building permits not being a structural amendment, but still would have been something that would have been considered. I think it certainly to me seems like, and also based on Clayton's, recommendation that it falls more toward it not being a structural amendment. I think it makes sound sense for us to also come to that conclusion in this instance. All right, we can, take a vote if we don't have any other questions or clarifications. Okay, so we have a motion for approval by Miles, a second by Mikkel. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Okay, motion passes. All four commissioners in favor, I think. Yes, correct. Thank you, everyone. Meeting in the middle of the day. Really, really appreciate your participation. Thank you, Clayton.
Very helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Clayton.
Thank you all. Corey, I don't think there's anything else really on the agenda. I'm gonna go ahead and step off unless you need me to stick around for something.
Thank you. No, that's perfect.
Okay, thank you all.
Thanks, bye.
All right, thanks, everybody. That was a good discussion. I think we did what we could, so.
People were supposed.
It's hard sometimes. As we all are human beings. and especially administrative things. We're not legislators. We don't get to just be like, nope, I don't like it.
Yep.
So, Corey and Anna and Bryce and everyone, thank you for the undoubtedly a huge amount of work that probably went into all of this. So thank you.
Well, thank you all for what is a very important discussion. You guys handled it, I think, really well and got truly to the heart of exploring all these questions because they are very good questions.
Mhm.
So appreciate your patience
Yeah,
in being willing to do that. So
totally. And
right back
Chrissy,
at you.
thank you so much for all your information. That was really valuable too.
Something to add to the discussion about the structural alteration.
Would you mind coming to the mic and saying your name before you do? I think
Generally,
that's okay.
because I think
Useful
everything
information.
Miles came up with is like, hey, here are some good ways to make the code better.
Yeah.
Important, Christina Sloan. I'm an attorney. This is not about the application you guys just considered, but Miles had some good recommendations about the minor versus major, which I know the planning commission wants to work on as well, or the planning department. But I think it's also important that structural alteration piece, when it comes from state code. State code also doesn't define structural alteration, but it's not just about structural alterations. I do think there's way too much emphasis on structural alteration instead of the whole provision, which Corey tried to bring up.
Yeah.
About the extension piece, and there's 100 years of case law. I didn't know this was an issue, or I would have briefed what is a change in a non-conforming use, but that is what that provision is about, which is consistent with case law. And the relevant analysis is not just an obvious change in use, right? That's clear, but also scope and scale of what that use is. And, these are small decks in this one, and unfinished space, square footage. So I think that adding a definition isn't going to help you because you got to look at the whole provision. So I just want to encourage y'all, if you're tweaking that to help you guys, which you should, the tweak needs to be bigger
Yeah.
than just the definition. You need to think about scope and scale and how you can maybe address that based on case law, and Clayton can help you guys do that.
Great.
But
Sure. No, thank you.
That's
Yeah.
very helpful.
yeah. And the contractor who feels very beat up does want y'all to know that there is that provision, which I point out in the memo, which I didn't realize either, that says that a site plan review exemption includes additions under 2,000 feet. He met with the building department who was like, oh, you're good. We got this landscape ordinance and you're exempted. No big deal. Now they don't have that in writing, and no one wants to throw anyone under the bus because all these guys are very appreciative of city staff. But the contractor did want me to let y'all know that he certainly wasn't trying to do this wrong.
Yeah.
So,
No, and I think
and I wasn't part of that, so I can't attest to any of it, but that is his position, and he feels bad, and he also feels bad that he's getting beat up. So
and
just
I would say,
FYI.
to be clear, I don't think the intent is to beat up on the contractor or lay blame or anything like that. It's more just the precedent setting nature of it. We wanted to note that in the future, if people
Right.
are thinking that this is a good way to go about it, it's not less an admonishment of the current development.
Totally.
So
And I think that part of the code is weird too. Like even if that exemption paragraph had referenced later on, like this level 2 thing, which is specific, so it controls,
Mhm.
it does control legally, but like contractor can't read that stuff together.
Totally.
Building official isn't as clear. And who knows, maybe building official was like, I'm cool, go talk to Corey. And that conversation didn't happen. I have no idea. I wasn't there. I have no idea. But I do think like those kind of inconsistencies are hard for contractors
totally,
to know what to do and when. and all
I think
that
for
stuff.
anybody, frankly, there's
Totally.
a lot.
Yeah.
The code doesn't make
The
so much
code.
sense.
I know. All right.
Okay, thank you. All right, future agenda items at our meeting in 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
April 11th, I believe.
thanks, Christina.
I think we're doing the annexation. We're gonna try and have, the Shamrock annexation, 1082 Main Street.
Yeah,
Um,
Shumway annexation is going before council at their next meeting, which
Yep.
would tee us up for the first meeting in April to have it come before planning commission. It won't be a public hearing, but we'll be kind of getting to dig into the general plan analysis and staff report. So we kind of actually get into the fun stuff there.
Cool.
And then beyond that, we may have a minor subdivision ready as well. We're going through some of the final comments right now. It's a 3-week turnaround's possible for them. There's a few comments they need amended to the plat, but certainly at least the one action item, possibly 2, maybe 3.
A minor subdivision, which I now know, thanks to extensive case law reading, does not vest a use of the property later on. Thanks to today's planning commission meeting.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
a fun little dive, frankly. I haven't gotten to do stuff like that in a while, so. Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you everyone for being here during, I know what is the workday for many of us, so
Thank you.
thank you. Thanks, staff.